Welcome to Think Out, the monthly debate series of the Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. At the Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity, we address the latest societal challenges through transdisciplinary team research, combining the latest in science and engineering with deep domain knowledge from social sciences, humanities, business, and the arts. In each Think Out, we bring together leading researchers and industry experts from very different disciplinary backgrounds to discuss and debate an important question the world is facing. In a Think Out, we aim to dive deep into a complex issue, have fun, and engage you, the audience, as much as we can in this open discussion between leading thinkers. Today, we address the question on how algorithms are directly or indirectly impacting society and causing social harm. We'll also discuss the social good they may add. I'm Vanessa Evers, and together with my colleague Hallam Stevens, we will moderate this debate. So over to you, Hallam, to introduce our experts.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. So we're very lucky to have with us today Boh Wai Fong from NTU's Business School, as well as my colleague from the School of Humanities, Andres Luco. I will introduce them formally in a minute, but I want to say a little bit about the format. I'm going to ask each of them in turn to give a little introduction to their kind of point of view, sort of around 5 minutes, as we usually do in these Think Outs. And then Vanessa and I are going to lead off with some questions, but we also hope that you in the audience will feel free to jump in and give us any questions. Right from the beginning, feel free to put your questions in the chat and engage with us and engage with our panelists today. Follow up, give comments. We really welcome your engagement as we always do. We also, as usual, have a poll question to start off with. We do this at the start and the end. And perhaps we can put that up right now as I do my introductions. Our poll question today is, who has the responsibility to govern algorithms that shape people's behavior? So is it companies? Do you think it's companies, governments, other regulatory bodies, or others? So let me, while that is up there, in fact, I can introduce the participants. Let me first introduce Professor Boh Wai Fong from the Nanyang Business School. She's a professor of information systems and the head of the Division of Information Technology and Operations Management and the director of the Information Management Research Center at NTU. Her research interests focus on the areas of knowledge, innovation, and innovation management and social media. And she's going to draw on her expertise today to address this question of algorithms and social harm. Associate Professor Andres Luco, as I mentioned, is in the School of Humanities at NTU. His work focuses on ethics, moral philosophy, and social and political philosophy. His work ranges across the evolution of moral judgment, impartiality, moral progress, and our reasons for being moral. His work looks at questions at the intersections of ethics, Darwinian, human sciences, and the mind sciences. He also thinks about how to maintain respect for human rights in an era of radical technological innovation. And he has collaborated on a project exploring the limitations and challenges of using AI to block online speech. So perhaps at this point we can close the poll. Can we close the poll now? Although on my end it says that people can't vote yet, so I'm not sure what happened there. But perhaps at this point I can ask Professor Boh to begin with her introduction. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks Hallam very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about online platforms. Basically, our topic is on social harm. I thought that maybe it's good for us to set the stage, first discussing why are we using so much on this online digital platforms, like social media platforms, and what role do they serve? I think coming from the business school, naturally we start from the business perspective, right? If you look at the most valuable firms in the world, in fact, it's the technology firms. what we call the FANG, the 5 most popular and best performing American technology companies: Facebook, America, Apple, Netflix, and Alphabet. Actually, they have a combined market capitalization of nearly 7.1 trillion as of August of 2021. So you can see that these are really making a big impact on the world. And I guess it's precisely because of the impact that they are making that it's important for us to look at this topic of potential harm that use of such online platforms can cause. There are also, of course, benefits of using these platforms. And this is the reason why these companies are playing such an important role. So what are some of the benefits? I think in terms of benefits, first of all, platforms increase efficiency of trade and lower search costs, lower production and verification costs. So online platforms match basically users with the information that they are seeking. The social media platforms match us with our friends and help us to keep in contact with them. Online platforms such as e-commerce platforms, they match buyers to sellers. So they really play a very critical role in lowering search costs and helping us to also talk to people who are more verified in terms of who they are. So digital platforms also facilitate innovations, such as, we have companies like Apple building a whole ecosystem of software developers. Even Facebook has also enabled a whole ecosystem of innovators, of content producers, as well as companies, advertisers who are using their platforms to do very targeted search and get a much better understanding of their target markets. And of course, as they now provide us with lots of functionality that we cannot live without. So a lot of people cannot live without their social media accounts because it's a key way that they communicate with others. And I guess given all these key characteristics of the platform, it's also important for us to realize that a lot of times companies themselves are now serving as self-regulators. Because these digital platforms are becoming so powerful and also are evolving over time, effectively, most of the time establish their own rules through which various users interact and decide, what kind of behaviors they would choose to encourage or discourage on the platform. So we can see that that is a really important role in impacting, our discussion later on. I'm going to stop here and I look forward to the discussions that we are going to have later on.
Thanks very much, Professor Boh. Just to briefly report on the result of the poll, the result was that 34% of you think that companies should basically regulate themselves, and 39% think that government, so roughly equally split between sort of private and public regulation there, with sort of public regulation winning out slightly. So with that in mind, let me ask Professor Luco to give his brief introduction. Thanks.
Thank you, Hallam, and thanks everyone for joining us. I am very excited to be here to share some thoughts specifically about social media algorithms, and I have some slides to share for those who can see them. So the title of my talk is really a joke. It's "Social Media Will Destroy Us All," but I don't believe that, and I don't think you should either. But I do think that we need to learn more about how social media algorithms affect us, because there are some very concerning data and firsthand testimonies from people working in the major social media companies about the harmful effects of social media algorithms. And I think it's really a time of reckoning right now for social media companies. I think we should be assessing the activities of these companies through the lens of what is known as stakeholder corporate responsibility. And according to the view that I kind of want to make a case for, I think government intervention definitely has a necessary role in regulating social media platforms and algorithms, but that role should be constrained for the sake of promoting freedom of speech and democracy and other benefits of social media. So that's the case I want to make. And I just wanted to say a few things about what information we have about what social media algorithms do. So starting with Facebook, the biggest social media product in the world. According to some recent reports that released companies' internal documents, machine learning algorithms are used to predict content that encourages user engagement on the platform. User engagement means clicks, likes, shares, and comments. And Facebook's term for this behavior is meaningful social interaction, or MSI. But the results of this pursuit of user engagement seems to be that the platform puts on a prominent display divisive content and misinformation on the user feeds of politically oriented Facebook users. In fact, the angry emoji on Facebook was given 5 times the weight of a like, according to a recent report, because the angry emoji would spur or generate more engagement than mere likes. But of course, you can imagine that what kind of content the angry emoji would be elicited by. It would be a lot of divisive material, a lot of misinformation. Turning now to Instagram. Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, has an algorithm that curates images and videos on the Explore page. And again, the objective here is to generate engagement. But according to a Wall Street Journal report from this year, Facebook's own research found that 30% of girls active on Instagram said that when they feel bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse. And among teens suffering from suicidal thoughts, 13% of British users and 6% of American users attributed the desire to kill themselves to Instagram. And here's one more worrying finding. This is from a Wall Street Journal investigation of TikTok. The Wall Street Journal found that when a user lingers on a TikTok video or watches a TikTok video, the algorithm will feed the user similar content. And that's the way that TikTok gauges users' preferences and keeps the users on the platform. But the result of this seems to be that it drives particularly vulnerable users, like users who suffer from depression, into rabbit holes of content that reinforces unhealthy thoughts and behaviors, like videos about suicide. So there are some very concerning trends and findings. One finding from a report looking at rates of self-harm, self-poisonings, and suicides among young adolescent girls in the United States found that there was a very dramatic increase in these self-harming and suicidal behaviors from 2001 to 2019, which coincides with the era of smartphone access and internet use. So this is a very concerning trend. We have a generation of smartphone users who've basically grown up with this technology, and among young adolescent girls in particular, there has been an unprecedented spike in this self-harming and suicidal behavior. So those are some key concerns, right? It looks like social media companies may be using algorithms that cause harmful behaviors and other harms like misinformation, hate speech, polarization, political manipulation, violence, mental illness, cyberbullying, and the loss of privacy. But on the other hand, there are many benefits, which my colleague Wai Fong so nicely described, like freedom of expression, voice, exchange of ideas and information, social contact across time and space, personalization, and quite possibly even democracy. So there was one study by two political scientists that was published in 2020, which found a strong positive correlation between the use of Facebook and the democracy rating of a country. And this study looked at 125 countries. So it's possible that Facebook use and other social media platforms promote democracy, which is a good thing, but I put a question mark kind of by that claim, because it seems that there are other concerning trends, like the use of social media for the purpose of political misinformation and manipulation that may feed anti-democratic sentiments as well. So I guess I'll just tie off my comments with just some thoughts about what why social media algorithms do this and what we can do about these effects. And well, the basic reason is that engagement-oriented algorithms boost profits from advertising. So advertisers get credible assurance that ads targeted to certain kinds of users and consumers will be seen. So that's the main reason that social media algorithms so heavily emphasize engagement these days. And that is in essence that in essence creates a problem of incentives, because now social media companies have an incentive to boost content that predicts engagement, but this content could be harmful content. So for example, Mark Zuckerberg, according to a recent report, shot down proposals by his company's own researchers to cut down on hate speech, nudity, graphic violence, and misinformation about the coronavirus. And the reason he did that was that he noticed that these kinds of content were correlated with engagement, and he didn't want to sacrifice in engaging content for the purpose of removing it from the platform and hopefully, averting harms. So this is the problem of incentives that social media companies face. On the one hand, there's content that very potentially or maybe even likely causes significant harm to users. But on the other hand, this content creates engagement, which is essential to these companies' profit models. So, and the problem is put very well by the recent Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen, who said, Facebook can change, but it's clearly not going to do so on its own. And that's why I think that what we should be doing is applying a stakeholder corporate social responsibility model in our assessments of the activities of social media companies and their algorithms. This model suggests that a firm's business decisions should serve the needs and interests of all stakeholders. And stakeholders are any individuals or groups who are affected by a firm's activities. They include, but are not limited to, stockholders, the people who own shares of a firm, but stakeholders also include customers, employees, suppliers, and communities who are affected by a firm's activities. So you might, there are critics of this model who suggest that companies shouldn't have to sacrifice profits for the sake of promoting social welfare. I don't have much sympathy with those criticisms, but one thing that could be said against those criticisms is that actually social responsibility is good for business. So there are some interesting studies and arguments suggesting that having a social responsibility orientation and serving the needs and interests of all stakeholders can actually promote employee commitment to a company, investor loyalty to a company, and customer satisfaction, which is all favorable to a firm's ability to earn profits. So here are some final thoughts on what should be done. So from a governmental perspective, so I think, of course, government regulation does have a role to play in regulating social media platforms and algorithms, but we don't want to stamp out the benefits of social media, especially the benefits for free speech and democracy. So I think the interventions should be targeted more at how algorithms feed content to users and not so much at what content does or does not appear in the first place. And if there is any regulation of content, it should be focused, decentralized, and subject to human review. So for example, I think government should require labeling of misinformation and content that poses health risks, but there should be fact checking and public health organizations who could work with social media platforms to determine what content gets labeled and how it gets labeled. So those are just a few thoughts of mine. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks to both of you for your introductions. So I guess I just want to maybe begin the discussion with a little bit of a further provocation on that point and see what you both think. I mean, the way you presented it, I mean, it sounds like this idea of corporate social responsibility or stakeholder corporate responsibility is asking the companies to change themselves in some ways, right? Which seems like what Frances Haugen said they won't do, right? And it does seem to me that the way you presented at the beginning, the very interest of the company seems to be towards promoting the very anti-democratic things that we don't want, right? So I'm just wondering, like, yeah, why should we think that Facebook, or, let's not pick on them too much, any of these companies will actually change themselves, right? I mean, I guess, yeah, why do you think that there is going to be a motivation for them to transform themselves into something democratic or more socially useful?
So maybe I'll start, and Andres can sort of contribute your views, yeah? This is a topic I discuss in my classroom when I talk to executives. And I'm trying to do precisely what Hallam you're saying. How do we tell them that this is something important for them as managers to look at? I think one of the key things that I try to bring across is that it's firstly about risk management when you come from the company's perspectives, because there are these downsides that is happening to the society, to the consumers. They can actually fire the firm and create various reputational risks, or even very fundamental risks in terms of the operations of their business, if their own business is really in the business of developing algorithms and using these algorithms to influence the behaviors of the individuals. So understanding the risks that they have is really important. And I guess the second point that I often make to my students in the classroom is that I personally don't believe these companies set out to create algorithms that are harmful. As Andres says, there are certain incentives which are somewhat misaligned, in the sense that over time, companies like Facebook might find that those posts that create the most engagement, which is what they are trying to optimize, are actually the ones which tends to be, let's say, fake news or more polarizing. So these posts end up doing the most social harm, and yet they create the most engagement. So this is where the misalignment in incentives come in. And I think oftentimes firms might not know that to start off with, right? Because a lot of times these algorithms, they learn from the data, and because they are machine learning and AI techniques that are being used, they are probabilistic in nature. Because they are probabilistic in nature, they learn over time and they start to present certain outcomes, which is somewhat unexpected. So I think I tend to highlight in my class to the managers that you might not think that you set out to do this, but you have to be aware of the developments in the algorithms over time. And therefore, it is about putting in place certain mechanisms and processes to ensure that the managers or the companies become aware of that. And as a result, then can have a conversation about this and start to make, I guess, good decisions. And oftentimes the other thing is that things are not so straightforward. It's not so clear-cut to many of the managers, right? Because there are multiple stakeholders here. They are accountable to these multiple stakeholders, and they can't simply be talking about, okay, because this is doing social harm, therefore we close down Facebook, right? Because Facebook also has various benefits that it is providing. So oftentimes it's a trade-off that the companies have to engage in, but they have to be aware of what is the harm, and then engage in these kind of trade-offs. And I guess the other thing is be open, about the conversations that they're having, at least internally, so that everyone becomes aware and everyone becomes part of this conversation. So this is what I tell managers, and I find that this is probably a better way to convince them rather than, right up front tell them, all these are harmful and therefore thou shalt not do it. Because I guess the other thing is we have to take note of compliance costs, because requiring organizations to put in a series of mechanisms does increase compliance costs for the organizations, which is fine for a big company like Facebook or Google. But think about the small organizations that are trying to innovate, the startup companies. If right up front we put in all these costs and mechanisms to say that you have to actually do all the following, it will actually stifle innovation amongst the smaller players. So I think a balance is really required here to actually think about the compliance costs, but yet at the same time, not sweep all these issues under the carpet and be able to have these conversations about them.
Andres, please. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes. Yes. I would say that it's not likely that the social media companies will, of their own accord, change their behavior because their ability and willingness to do so is a limited resource, right? The profit model is essentially dependent on engagement, and their own internal studies are showing that this harmful content, or possibly harmful content, actually does serve those engagement goals. There was one story, just to illustrate the point about how Mark Zuckerberg, founder and CEO of Facebook, he actually put out a public post explaining the problem. And he said, yes, it's true that, as you have posts and other content, other media that run up against our community standards, the engagement with that content increases. And of course, with more engagement, we get more profit. And then Mark Zuckerberg said, okay, well, here's a solution. We reduce the visibility of content that comes close to breaching our Facebook community standards. So this is sort of a recognition by Mark Zuckerberg that this is a problem, and there's to some extent a willingness to do something about it, and yet Facebook's not following through, and neither of the other social media companies. So there's something that's holding them back. And one is that there's a fear of losing this dominant position. Just as Wai Fong said, there are compliance costs. So if Facebook kind of regulates itself, that opens a vacuum for other platforms that would be sort of less self-restrained to find an edge in the market. And Facebook doesn't want that, right? So I think that this is really the reason why government intervention is so important to impose system-wide constraints on all competitors to reduce potentially harmful content in spite of its engagement potential.
Thanks. So I guess we can open the floor up to our discussion. So feel free to unmute yourself, Wai Fong and Andres, and just yeah, engage in the discussion in a maybe less formal way. Yeah, Hallam, I was thinking you're a historian, so you are much better at this than me, having a computer science background. But all these talk about, you know, how governments may interfere, and looking at the questions that are coming up in the Q&A, which are kind of also around, you know, how much should governments interfere. I was thinking of like these like old railroads, when the railroad started and big companies started these railroads, and then, you know, things got a little bit out of hand. So the state said, you know, we'll do the railroads because, you know, that's just much better for everyone. And then, you know, they didn't do a great job of that. And at some point people said, well, it's better to privatize it, have a company run it so that, you know, it's actually being kept well, etc. And there's this kind of ping-ponging between, yeah, ownership. And I know we're not talking about ownership, but the content kind of asks us a question about ownership, because it is content is owned, is created, and it seems to impact us now. It seems to really affect our behaviors because of what's going on. I think your comments were really about maybe not so much the algorithms themselves and what they can do, but how the companies use the algorithms to maximize profit, maximize engagement, and they could also maximize them for good. It's just that they won't do that for themselves. So could you have some discussion around the role of the government? Are you talking like, yeah, they should butt in, or are we talking about they should really take over, or are we talking about more like privatization in a different way, or maybe even municipalization where there's more public ownership? What would be possible models and thoughts you might have?
Yeah, I think the government does have an important role to play. But having said that, like I said just now, it's also important for the government not to overregulate, right? Because that can stifle innovation. I think recently the IMDA, together with the Computer Science Society, put out certain documents on AI ethics. And I think they put out a framework that highlights various components, such as advocating for roles within organizations, advocating, I guess, very much putting in place processes to have those conversations that I talked about here. I think this is the right way to go. And in my view, as the government realizes the importance of this, it might be actually good to institutionalize or regulate some of these. So right now, it's very much put out as a governance framework that companies are advocated to embrace and look at, right? And I guess right now, it's very much going on the route of educating and then encouraging firms. I think that is a good first step, because you don't want to start off with any change management with a top-down mandate. Because if you do this, people might actually comply in form, but they actually don't comply in substance. So that makes the entire regulatory framework sort of quite useless. So I do feel that it's important to start with this education and encouragement approach, so that when initial, I guess, upswell of companies voluntarily embrace such regulatory requirements or such best practices, then the government would have enough teeth to set in to say that, hey, this is clearly important enough in the industry have started to do this. And then you can start to see adoption, I guess, taking off more widely, very similar to the any contagion model that we would look at. So I would think that this is a really important steps, because we can't really launch straight into a regulation and say that, you know, all companies should do these without having that buy-in from the various managers and companies. Yeah.
Wai Fong, before I ask Andres also to comment on this, there's there's a question very much related to this by anonymous question. So I can't credit anybody for asking this, but in relation to what you just said, they said, like, other than a legislative move to govern these companies, perhaps one way is for users to boycott these companies that have, say, a bad heart. And maybe someone would need to start another Facebook-like platform that has a better value system, kind of how open source software makers kind of use their software as a counter source to companies that are mostly profit driven. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a model you think might work?
I think that every organization that starts may end up, driven by the inherent structure of the incentives and motivations that I think Facebook faces. I personally just feel that there's no such thing as an evil company. Companies are what they are. They make the decisions that they are, resulting from the structures and incentives systems that they have, which is imposed upon them by the various stakeholders. So any company that essentially evolves might start off by saying that I'm not Facebook. What is to tell that eventually they may not become Facebook once they have all the data and they start to make an equally important impact? I don't think personally that's the solution to the problem. I think the solution is having greater transparency, so that I think it's actually good that Facebook actually engages get their researchers to look at some of the data and to study this. It's bad if the company just says that, okay, I don't even want to have people to research this, but more of this can be done, right? Even engaging external researchers like us to actually start and engage further in the conversation would be ways to go. So I think these would be more structural solutions to increase the transparency and increase the conversations, rather than have another company which says that I won't be Facebook, but what is to say the company will not eventually be like that?
Right.
I want to give Andres a chance to respond too, but I think one of the answers to that may have to do with size, right? And yeah, I mean, I think the fact that Facebook is so large, right, is an important factor here, because they have so much power, right? And I think so. This is where the kind of idea of breaking up Facebook has come from, right? Or breaking up these large companies has come from. And I think it goes back to the point Vanessa was making about the kind of robber barons in the 19th century and so on, right? Where they had to be broken up. The feeling was they had to be broken up because they were so large, right? And so, but perhaps Andres, you maybe want a chance to respond here.
Oh, okay, no problem. Yeah, so I'll just respond to Vanessa's question from a bit ago. So, yeah, in terms of possible government actions, I mean, I think we should be very, very careful about allowing governments to control what content appears on social media platforms. Because of its obvious consequences for freedom of expression. So Facebook had ceded effective control of its platform in Vietnam to the government, and the predictable thing happened. Dissidents and opposition figures in large numbers had their posts blocked. So I don't think that's a desirable outcome. But what I think governments can do is to engage in kind of more targeted interventions, modeled very much on the pharmaceutical industry. So governments can engage in oversight and certification and licensing of algorithms that feed content to users, with a view to mitigating public health risks, for example, or misinformation. And for this to happen, though, a lot of work has to be done. We have to understand better what the impacts of social media algorithms are, and that would require more transparency and openness on the part of social media companies, which would need to actually allow outside parties, outside researchers to examine their algorithms and their effects on users. And so there's kind of a fine balance there, because of course, you know, the platforms algorithms are proprietary, but at the same time, there's a significant public interest in ensuring that they don't have harmful effects. So, you know, that's one possibility, I think, is to focus on the algorithms, how they feed content to people, not what content is allowed to appear. But even there, I think there would be significant scope for government involvement and cooperation between these private firms and government.
So Anders, this is very much related to what Jackie Wong is saying in the questions. Mentions that how can social media companies pursue their profit, generating business objective, for instance, through advertising, while regulating the contents and the engagement to ensure a safe environment for their users. It's kind of like saying, okay, yeah, I think you're saying it would be good for governments to, in a way, demand that. I also feel like in our discussions so far, it's been a little bit like, well, you know, companies need to make money, they need to have profit, they need to grow. So, you know, we have to allow them to do that. And I feel a little bit outraged, I have to say, because of course, you know, in order for companies to become powerful, they have to grow, and it's not always a bad thing, but can we not demand more? I feel a little bit like, yeah, you know, the government should really do something. But, you know, the government can do this or that, but not too much. Wai Fong, I understand that too. They cannot do too much, because otherwise they'll kill the little guy who's also trying to build up some innovation. Yeah, but I have to say, I do feel a little bit an activistic gene kind of engaging, saying like, yeah, but it's ridiculous, you know, there are girls thinking about killing themselves, and we're talking about, well, maybe a little bit of government regulation. Can we demand more? Can we demand more from these companies? And how would we do that?
Andres, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you know, public pressure is the root of these kinds of movements to generate enough political will for the government to intercede, and also to give the social media platforms effectively a profit motive to do something about this, because they don't want, you know, their image to be tarnished. They want to protect their reputation, if nothing else. And if customer satisfaction and reputation are at risk, that would add, you know, some incentive for them to move away from a completely engagement-driven model to one that promotes, you know, well, the interests of all stakeholders, right? You know, and so I think, yes, absolutely. And I think there are things that people can do. So I think it goes back to better understanding the effects of the platforms. So we should do so at an individual level as well. It's really important to know that if you suffer from a mental illness, that it's possible for you to be kind of driven into a rabbit hole of this sort of perpetuating cycle of feeding yourself more and being fed more and more content that, you know, only exacerbates, you know, your symptoms. So you should be aware of that. There should be health professionals and clinicians who should be advising their patients on the effects of social media use. But this all depends on having a robust understanding of the algorithms and their effects.
I just want to also highlight that, you know, like Jackie was talking about the FMCG companies going green. The similar way, many companies can be greenwashing, right? Telling the whole world that, you know, I'm green, but are they really green? And we know companies engage in a lot of that. So in a very similar manner, I guess, Vanessa, to your point about why can't we have more regulations? We certainly can. The key question is, do the companies fundamentally believe in it, and is it substantive, right? Or is it simply just on the surface? So I think we all know that, just doing it on the surface will not be effective and helpful. So I think regulation on its own will not solve the problem, because if people are not fundamentally bought into this, the companies may not actually take real action to actually make the necessary changes. So that's why I think the education part is just as important compared to the regulations bit,
And so are you saying that, if, say, Mark Zuckerberg himself doesn't feel it really strongly inside, it doesn't matter kind of what kind of regulations or kind of pandering to the things that we need will be enough? Like but how do you re-educate someone like Mark Zuckerberg? How do you re-educate that group of people worldwide? Is that reasonable to expect within the time span that we need it? Like, what do we have, 10 years to, is that a realistic thing that we can do?
I mean, in the case of Facebook, honestly, I'm a little bit more worried about their move towards the Metaverse, because I think the discussion on the Metaverse highlights that even more data is going to be collected about the users. And if you are really thinking about a Metaverse, then you need to have more sharing of data across platforms. So you will have more data that's collected from Facebook or Meta now being shared with other platforms. And the Metaverse is going to be more immersive. The whole idea of addiction is going to be even greater now. I cannot imagine my kids, next time, how am I going to stop my kid from, entering the Metaverse and go for dinner with me or walk with me, right? So I think these are really worrying questions that I think we will need to think about as we enter the next phase. Because I think things are evolving. So we also have to look at how things are evolving, and then how we need to actually put in place regulations. So to me, I'm more worried not about what Facebook does now. I'm actually more worried about what they would be doing in that Metaverse next alternative that they are trying to propose. And I think we should be trying to, I guess, put more public pressure on the company and the companies that is trying to all engage in this Metaverse, I guess, creation, to really start thinking about all these problems up front, rather than worry about them, later on as they find them out, right? So I think we can, given our experience with our current internet technology, we can already foresee problems that will arise in that next version of this internet. And I think that, to me, is the next frontier we should more actively manage,
So we've touched on this a little bit already, but I mean, following up on that, I mean, I'm just looking at a couple of questions in the chat here, and these are questions about data, right? So one question in the chat is about, do we have enough data to study these algorithms? And also another question, possibly from the same person, they're anonymous, I can't really tell, but and how do we know if particular content is harmful, right? Maybe there's some that are very clear, but maybe some seem harmful, but or seem that they're not harmful, but they actually are harmful. And that seems to me a question of data as well. And I wonder whether, in some sense, that's based on what you were just saying, Wai Fong, that may be part of the crux of the problem here, right? That there's a lack of transparency about what these companies are really doing. And, some of the things with Facebook we were talking about have only come to light because they've been leaked in one way or another, right? So, yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about whether this data question is really the issue here.
Yeah, I do agree that I think in this aspect, it would be nice if, as researchers, we can actually have a chance to study some of these problems, because we will provide a more, I guess, independent view of both the harm as well as the benefits from these, and that increases the conversation. So right now, we don't have access to a lot of these data. as researchers. It's really Facebook depending on their own internal research teams to study these and then publicize it internally, and some of them get leaked, as Hallam says. So I think that this is one way that really the company should think about increasing that transparency. And I think in terms of the other question about, how do we know whether something is harmful or not? I subscribe to that thinking that probably nobody really knows up front, just like Facebook also discovered post hoc that those posts that are increasing engagement are the ones that are most polarizing or fake news. But once they discovered that, then I guess it's really, they should be doing something about that, right? And they should be starting to use the algorithm to actively detect some of these so that they will counter some of the algorithms that they have. So I do think that these are responsibilities that the companies should adopt. And it seems that they are adopting it to a certain extent, but probably can be improved.
Yeah. Can I add to that? Thanks. Yeah, this is, I mean, I would just echo everything Wai Fong says, even though this is supposed to be a bit of a debate. But yeah, I would say we do have a data deficit. The studies that have been reported are internal studies from Facebook's own researchers. We don't have the details of those studies. We don't know exactly what the quality of those studies was. So, for example, the finding about Instagram and teenagers reporting that having negative self-image about their bodies was attributed to using Instagram. It's unclear how that finding was arrived at. If the subjects are just being asked, well, does Instagram make you feel bad about your body? That might be a leading question, and they might be prone to answer yes when really a proper study that involved a control group would not reveal that effect. So what I think we need is better. Of course, well, we need to ensure that there are well-designed studies involving clinical trials and control groups, but we should be able to open the black box a bit, and we should be able to look at how the algorithms work so that we have a more fine-grained understanding of their effects. And at this point in time, the social media platforms are not willing to open up the black box because they're claiming intellectual property. So I think that's a serious problem that should require a policy solution.
Great, thanks. There are so many questions left, and there's still so much to learn from both of you. This discussion, I think, could go on for another hour, and we have to start wrapping up. I'll just summarize the questions that are left that we really didn't have the chance to answer yet. But they're, for instance, around what users can do. Can they exercise self-control? Can they vote with their business? What about, for instance, certification, social responsibility certification? Could that be like a guideline for people to know where to make use of these companies or not? The problem was the curation of content. That seems to be something that companies kind of use to say, well, we wanted to, we just can't. That might be something that either machine learning could fix, or maybe we need to train a whole new generation of students that are able to contribute in that way. I can imagine it's a tough job. And then some questions around, okay, what does that mean for young people related to that? How we can prepare young people for a future where they can be protective of their privacy and protective of their healthy behaviors and lifestyle. We won't get the chance to answer all of these. We've addressed lots of them, and that was really wonderful. Maybe we should bring up the poll one more time to find out if people have changed their mind. Hallam, you mentioned that the poll in the beginning was a little bit kind of like even, 34% company regulations, 39% governments.
Right, so let's see if we've shifted it at all.
Yeah, I should not say anything. You mean?
Yeah.
So while oh, sorry, go ahead.
I guess if either of you have any kind of last comments or responses to any of those particular questions, obviously we can't answer them all, but if you have any ones that you think are particularly important, Andres, Wai Fong, perhaps you have some.
I thought the idea that Josh, right, highlighted on certifications, I think it's a good one, yeah, because it's very aligned with the concept that you let users choose, yet you provide the incentives for organizations to do the right things. So I do like, and I think this kind of approaches seems to me will be more effective because you don't sort of demand that everybody should do this, but you give the incentives for people to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I might ask, if I might try to respond to the question about, user responsibility, yeah, I think for vulnerable users, I don't think we can expect them to kind of have that self-control and be able to sort of take responsibility and, free themselves or keep themselves from falling into rabbit holes, because they are the ones who are most susceptible to kind of addictive behavior or behavior that involves kind of a vicious cycle. So, people who suffer from depression are actually known to be people who are less able to exercise self-control, and they can be kind of taken over by their negative thoughts. And if you have content that's sort of reinforcing those negative thoughts and feeding them more and more of it as they select it, then I don't think it's realistic to expect a vulnerable individual to sort of pull themselves out. But for others who are more fortunate, yeah, I think we can maybe be aware of this the fact that algorithms are designed to provoke engagement, and that doesn't necessarily mean things you like. Okay, it just means time on the platform. So things that make you angry, things that outrage you will be fed to you, because that keeps you on the platform. And if you don't want to expose yourself to such negativity, then it's probably better to just be kind of a fly on the wall, just be a passive scroller, which is the opposite of what Facebook and the other media platforms they want you to do. They don't want you to just passively scroll through things.
Doom scrolling.
Yeah, they just want you to like and especially dislike things, but that may lead you to a place where you don't want to be. So yeah, if you're fortunate enough, you can exercise a degree of control over what gets fed to you on these platforms, and that requires having an understanding of how the algorithms work.
Yeah, consigning us to a wishy-washy life of doom scrolling, passive doom scrolling.
Add that actually there was a study that was done in Harvard that actually did show if people use social media mindfully, sort of as part of their daily routine, and not be too emotionally connected to the content, it actually leads to some positive effects in terms of positive mental health and social well-being. So it's not all so it's the mindfulness that we should exercise as individuals. Yeah.
This is a great positive note for us to close on. Thank you so much, Andres. Thank you so much, Wai Fong. This brings us to the end of our Think Out debate. Thanks to both of you, Wai Fong, expert in online media and innovation management, and Andres Luco, specialized in social, political ethics and philosophy. So the famous Think Out water bottle is a huge collector item. You may not know this. It's coming your way. Thank you so much for joining us. Audience, thank you so much for your participation. Please follow us on our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Twitter. Although I think I should say, please don't follow us on Facebook, Instagram. Learn more.
They're providing good and engaging content that is
Right.
well
Exactly.
people's well-being.
If you want to learn more about this debate series, if you want to learn more about the research and access the research papers of both Andres and Wai Fong, you can find it there in a positive, mindful way. And please join us for next month's debate on the 3rd of December on genomics and the new inequalities. Thank you so much. Thanks, Andres. Thanks, Wai Fong.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.